You're listening to the Full-Time Function Musician Podcast, episode 22.
You're listening to the Full-Time Function Musician Podcast, the #1 resource for growing your function musician business. If you're a solo wedding singer, part of a 12-piece luxury show band, or anything in between, and want to learn from other successful musicians, you're in the right place.
You're listening to the Full-Time Function Musician Podcast. I am your host, Jack Twiner. If this is your first time listening, then welcome. If you're a regular listener, then welcome back. This podcast is for function musicians who are looking to grow their business, book more gigs, hear some inspiring stories, and generally just learn from others who've been doing it successfully for years. I have such a great episode for you today on some topics that I've definitely struggled with before, and I'm 100% sure all of you have as well. I'm going to get straight into it. So yeah, I hope you enjoy my conversation with John Blackburn. You're listening to the Full-Time Function Musician Podcast, and on today's episode, I'm super excited that we have our first returning guest, John Blackburn. Welcome back to the podcast.
Nice to be here, Jack. Nice to see you.
So for some people, this will be their first time listening, and you were back on episode 14, I believe, and where we talked about the importance of setting goals, which is a great episode, and definitely go back and listen to that if you haven't. But if you haven't listened to it, maybe you could just give us a little quick intro on yourself and what you do and how you do it.
Great. Thanks, Jack. So my name's John Blackburn. I'm a coach for live entertainment professionals, live entertainment companies. And what I do is I work with people on their businesses and their lives around their businesses. And the main things that I use in that work is a thing called neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, and I'm also a qualified coach. So it's a process of getting people to dial in and get really specific about the experiences they're having and the experiences they want to have, and then finding out what the little tweaks they need to make in what they do to move them from the thing they have to the thing they want. I've also been a professional drummer since I was, I went to music college and studied jazz of all things at Leeds, and then I've also been, a touring professional drummer since that time, and I still love that. I still gig every week, every month, and so my time is basically split between these two things I really love: playing the drums, which is supporting musicians and entertainers in one way, and then this coaching stuff, which I feel just supports them in a different way.
Awesome, man. Yeah, it's good to have you back. So this episode is going to be slightly different than usual, really, because we've kind of just given ourselves a subject and we're going to kind of just dive into it and see where it goes. But what we are going to be talking about, I think, is super important and super relatable to probably everyone listening, which is imposter syndrome and overwhelm, and maybe how we can deal with those things in terms of being a business owner as well as a musician, I think. So I guess let's start with, what is imposter syndrome?
Great. Well, that is a good place to start, because you could ask two people that say they have imposter syndrome, and you could start asking them questions about what their actual experience was. And of course, the answers you get back can be quite different. Sometimes the differences are subtle, but sometimes they're not subtle at all. For example, we probably both know and have worked with people that experience total confidence and focus on the stage, but then when they go to call a client about a potential booking, suddenly get some of this imposter syndrome stuff. So this imposter syndrome stuff is a very personal experience. It's not like if you speak to a friend of yours on the phone and they say, "Oh, I've got a broken leg." If they tell you which leg it is, you know what the problem is, exactly what the problem is, don't you? Mm-hmm. There's a bone in their leg that has a fracture in it. Like, you know what the problem is. Imposter syndrome and all of these things that exist sort of largely in the sort of thinking space and feeling space is a bit different. So one person's experience of imposter syndrome is going to be very different to the next person's experience of it. There will be things in common, which is why we have a name for it, which is why we can even talk about it, because we can say, "Oh, I had a bit of imposter syndrome." And you can go, "Wow, I know how you feel." So the first thing is understanding that everyone's experience of it will be different. And one of the things that it's useful to do is to get more specific in your description of how you experience the thing that you call imposter syndrome. And we might move on to that in a moment. But actually, the first thing to do is to flip the thing around and ask yourself a totally different kind of question. The first thing to do is, well, okay, I'm experiencing imposter syndrome. What would I like to experience instead? Right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people, they don't ask themselves that question. And the thing about the kinds of questions that you ask yourself is that, of course, dictates where your brain goes, doesn't it? So if someone were to say, why do I have imposter syndrome? You'll start coming up with a load of reasons why you should have imposter syndrome, why you should be having those experiences. Whereas if you say to yourself, well, okay, if I could have a different experience, what would I like instead? And if we take the case of someone who's perhaps experiencing some of those feelings in the business context, in the business bit of what they do as a performer and a band leader or whatever, you'd have to start getting specific and say, well, okay, when do I experience this thing that I call imposter syndrome? Let's say it's just before. Do you know what? It really comes up just before I have to speak to a client. Okay, well, in that moment where up till now I've had some imposter syndrome, what experience do I want instead that would change how I felt and change what I could do at that point? And then you ask that question as well. You can say, well, okay, that's the experience I want to have instead of the imposter syndrome. What do I want that experience? What do I want that feeling to enable me to be able to do on the telephone call? So it might be something like this. Here are some generic words that people might resonate with. You might decide that instead of imposter syndrome, you want confidence. And what you want to happen is you want to have an email inquiry come through and you want to react. And instead of going, oh, no, I've got to call them back, you want to go, yes, this could be a great gig. So maybe you want a bit of confidence and a bit of excitement. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then what you want to happen is say you want to get on the phone straight away. You don't want to put it off and procrastinate. You want to go straight to it. And then you want the conversation to go well. You want to speak to the person on the potential client in a certain way. And of course, what you want at the end of it is you want to get the booking, don't you? So if you start going through and maybe even write down some notes about the experience that you actually want, then what you can do is you can say, well, okay, have I ever had an experience like this before? Right? You can say, well, have I ever felt confident before? And I bet the majority of people that are listening to this podcast probably feel very confident on stage. There will be people that perhaps experience imposter syndrome on stage. But for the majority of people, when they're on stage and they're just doing their thing, they probably feel very confident. And even if you don't have that feeling on stage, find an experience that you've had where you felt confident. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be the kind of raging fire confidence, that kind of aggressive confidence. It just has to be the kind of feeling where you're like, yeah, I can do this. So yeah, think of a time when you felt confident, write it down, and then what you do is you go back into that experience in your own mind. Imagine like you were there at this moment where you had confidence. And what will happen is, and there's some NLP in here, what happens is as you start to see the things in your imagination that you saw at the time and hear the things that you heard at the time, including sounds around you, and importantly for most people, the things that they said to themselves, what you'll notice is you'll start to get a bit of that confident feeling just coming up because you're showing your brain all the things it saw when you were feeling confident. So you can kind of conjure up these past positive experiences at will. And the difference is, if you're experiencing imposter syndrome or those unhelpful feelings in a particular context, what you're doing is you're rehearsing feeling those feelings in that moment. And fundamentally, what you've got to do is you've got to rewire some pathways in your brain and your body so that as you approach that moment, you go, not imposter syndrome, this set of thoughts and this set of feelings. And in NLP, and coaching, we sort of have a variety of ways that we can that we can use with people to kind of embed that and program it, if you like, and have it become automatic and natural. But fundamentally, you can do this yourself right now. You can write down a list of, and this is a really good idea. So when you've written down a confident experience or an example of whatever you want instead of imposter syndrome, you write it down, describe it in real detail, and do this on paper. Describe what you saw, go through the senses, at the time, just as you were about to hear that confident moment. What did you see? What did you hear, both out in the world and inside? And then where did you notice the confidence feeling start in your body? Now, some people listening to this that have maybe never read about any of this stuff or tried any of these kinds of things might be thinking, well, how's that going to help? Well, it turns out that a lot of this stuff was sort of put together in the 70s by Richard Bandler and John Grinder, who came up with this NLP. And, there's thousands and thousands of us have been using it very consistently and successfully ever since. So that would be my recipe on the imposter syndrome and the overwhelm front. Identify that there's a problem, identify what you want instead, come up with an example of a time where you had something like that, and then practice going into that memory and that feeling over and over again. And if you're really struggling with it, obviously go and see an NLP practitioner or, even some hypnotherapy or something. It's not something that you have to keep for a long time.
Yeah, great stuff, man. I just wanted to talk about my experience recently with feeling like imposter syndrome, and that's with this podcast to an extent. Like feeling when I wanted to start it, thinking about seeing other podcasts and they're on episode 380 or whatever. I'm like, there's no way I could make 380 episodes of this. And
okay, pause.
Yeah,
that's beautiful. Sorry to interrupt.
No, please do.
That's a great example. So what you've just done there is you've given me a recipe for how to start feeling bad about a podcast.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said you looked at all these other podcasts and you saw that they were all on episode 300. And you said to yourself,
there's no way I can get there.
There's no way I can get that. And I bet when you said that, the voice that you said that to yourself, in your head, that voice was not a meek comedy voice. That was a big booming, Yeah. It was a voice that had some impact on you, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first part of your recipe for creating that imposter syndrome feeling. Sorry to interrupt, but do you see the kinds of things that we pay attention to?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay. Yeah.
So, and that stopped me from doing it for probably almost a year, putting it off, thinking, I can't do that. It's overwhelming to have to come up with that many ideas for episodes and stuff like that. But obviously I did manage to do it and we're here now. But I think my point of this is just taking it one step at a time and just thinking, and back to your episode that you were on before, and setting goals and just trying to work towards those goals, and the other stuff comes later, once you've reached that next step or whatever.
So Jack, and that is beautiful. So what you've just done there, Jack, is you've given us the Jack recipe for moving from imposter syndrome and overwhelm to taking action, right?
Yeah.
And what I'd be interested to know is, when did that switch happen? When was the moment where you changed? It went from, I'm putting it off, and then all of a sudden I'm taking action. I
think it was a gradual thing. I don't think it was like a click of the fingers. I think it was talking to people and thinking, you just got to try it. But you've been thinking about it for so long, you've just got to try it and see how it goes. If it goes nowhere, it's not the end of the world.
Right. So that's great. So again, that's more, so you spoke to some other people. Did you get some encouragement from them?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Right.
So you got some encouragement from other people, and that meant that you had some scenes, if you like, you could play over to yourself. If you had a moment where you said, I can't do this, you can then remember the conversations you had with people that I presume you trust or you like, so that when they say something, you believe them, you'll take them seriously. Yeah. So you've now got some reference experiences that lead you to think, oh, well, maybe now. And then that sentence was great. You just got to try it. That's a great, that's a great phrase.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's like a cliche. Well, I mean, it's maybe not a phrase, but it's better to have tried and failed than to never tried at all, and always be thinking about what could have been if you had tried it and stuff like that. I used to be a lot worse on things like that, but now I'm very much in the mindset, mainly because I've tried things and they have gone all right. And if it has gone as it has failed or gone badly, it's really not that badly. So I think, yeah, it's just you just got to push yourself a little bit.
That's great. So all of those things, Jack, every sentence that you just said there would go in the what I would describe as the like Jack Twiner recipe for success book, right? If someone came to me and said, "I'd like to start a podcast," and then talked about Overwhelm and Imposter syndrome, I would say, well, you know what? A friend of mine, Jack, he felt like that, and then what he did was he spoke to a few people. And they said, come on, you've got to try it. And then he started saying, actually, I've got to try it. And what's the worst that can happen? What's the best that could happen? What if it does work? What if it's great? And what if I have loads of fun? And that's another nice move, isn't it? People traditionally will ask negative what if questions, right? What if it goes wrong? What if my, I don't know, pants fly off in the middle of our shopping trip or something, right? All the horrendous, things. Well, what if it goes really well? What if you have loads of fun? What if you make loads of really good connections? What if you meet someone on that podcast journey who connects you with 10 videography clients? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you're going to play the what if game, I think you have to play it properly. That's the other thing. If you start playing the what if game, that's cool. Play the what if game. But you have to play the positive what if game. What if it goes really well? What could happen? And the other thing there is, just whilst we're up, because, I love thoroughness and completeness, Jack, if you're going to play the what if game, what if you do this thing and it doesn't work? What if you do this thing and it really works? What if you don't do anything? What are the negative consequences of not doing the podcast? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's it. People do the scary thing of taking action and they do the positive thing of not taking action. And actually, if you're going to play what if, you should do all four. So yeah, again, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because that has, I know I did it, but that's brought us around again to the kinds of questions that you ask yourself, like at the start. When we first started talking about Overwhelm. So yeah, the kind of questions the orientation, the aim of the questions that you ask yourself in your head are really significant.
I think maybe let's go on to some other things that you can do to sort of help with Overwhelm. And like one thing that I think causes anxiety and overwhelm and stuff is like just your sleep pattern and not getting enough rest and not taking days off and taking too many bookings, as you were just saying before we started this podcast. So organization and things as well. Maybe we can go into stuff like that.
Yeah, great. Well, there's a lot of advice out there on the internet, isn't there, about what you should and shouldn't do for, to feel a certain way or to avoid overwhelm and all that kind of thing. And what I always think is really interesting and why I love the coaching stuff that I do so much is everybody's answer to all of those questions is completely individual. So I can't remember whether we spoke about it previously, but a few clients of mine and friends of mine have early on in their coaching stuff have talked about sort of time management, and there are lots of books and lots of bits of advice and lots of frameworks on how to manage your time. And there's a couple that I use really regularly that I find really helpful. But what you've really got to do is actually do a load of stuff and figure out what actually works for you rather than what's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's a few things that I've been recommended over the years and I've even jumped on board with actually. Because I trust and respect the people that have suggested it, that actually were just nonsense for me. Like they had the opposite effect. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me or anyone else trying it. What that means is that result is not that method is not for you. So let's do this. We'll do the same thing. what do you want instead of the thing that you're currently experiencing?
Yeah.
So if it's time management, you've got to figure out, well, what is the goal of time management? Why do I need to, why is it important to manage my time? So you go through that and you figure out what your priorities are. Now, once you figured out what your priorities are, it's easy to start saying no to things, isn't it, that aren't your priorities. And straight away, there you go. You've created some space in your week, to look after yourself or whatever. And so, yeah, I think that the journey is discover your goals and priorities, know what's important to you, and then start experimenting with different ways that you could arrange your time, and pay attention to whether or not they actually work. Don't worry about who told you and whether it should work. Pay attention to what actually works, because you will have a way of managing your time that will feel very natural and that will work really well. It's just you might have been pulled away from it, or you might just not have even discovered it yet. For me, I used to write a lot of lists, and then I sort of got out of that. And then I did this kind of marketing course where they were really into this very, very prescriptive, like sort of time blocking thing on a spreadsheet, and I did that for a while, and it kind of worked until it didn't. So, but I thought that there was something wrong with me for a little while, because this was the way that, busy professionals manage their time. It's like, no. There's 1,000 different ways to do this. And of course, what I've got now, which actually allows me to get everything done in a way that I enjoy it, is just a much more flexible thing, because to me, flexibility is really important. When I looked at the people that were trying to teach me the spreadsheet thing, they were all very about structure and order, and they didn't really value flexibility particularly highly. So obviously a color-coded spreadsheet with every 15 minutes of your day allocated, and this is my rest period here for 15 minutes. And I can make a cup of tea here, but I have to drink it down here, So, yeah, pay attention to what actually works for you and just give a load of stuff a go.
Yeah. I think the key there is prioritizing as well and figuring out what that is. And I'm just going to go into my own experience again, just because it's easier to talk about myself. But my experience with my business, and when I started that, obviously it was fairly quiet. It got quite busy quite quickly, and I got overwhelmed because I was taking every single booking that I could get. And I'm sure that a lot of people listening will resonate with that as well, because that's what when you start, that's what you want. But then quickly you get overwhelmed and you can't fulfill as well as you want on everything. So then you have to figure out what's my priorities here. And then also adding to that, I got a puppy, and I'm sure other people that have experienced that or had kids, and then your priorities change again because you want more free time. So you have to figure those things out. And now I set my schedule up. It's kind of regimented. I'm definitely not the time blocking as that. I don't think that would quite work for me, but I do like a schedule. So my schedule now is I have to have Mondays off. Mondays is always off. That's not kind of negotiable. I do try my best to only do 2 shoot days a week, 2 editing days, and then a day to work on my business. And I think that's important for everyone as well, you need to book in time to work on your business, not in it, so that you can figure out all these things that we talk about on the podcast, like your content, and social media, and your all the other things that come with running a business, your accounting, and everything that's in there. So that's super important. And that will stop you feeling overwhelmed as well if you've got time set to work on all those things. And it's hard to completely say that I'm perfect at it and I manage to do it every week, but it's definitely helped for sure.
Yeah, great, Jack. And it certainly seems to me like you do really well with that stuff. You're running both, but the podcast is a bit.
Well, yeah, this adding this into the mix didn't help, I'll be honest, but
yeah, but it seems like you're handling it pretty well. And,
yeah.
The fact that we've been able to coordinate a second episode despite internet problems and, all that kind of thing, like you're definitely doing it. And that's the other thing. I really enjoyed your description of your process and how you do it. I love the Monday day off. I had a Monday day off for a long time, and then I had Thursdays as my day off. And I completely agree with everything. I think I think that model that you put forward for a week there for people that do stuff like we do is probably a really good model. I agree with you totally about that time to work on the business instead of in the business. I love that phrase. I think if there was one thing that would maybe be really useful for people that haven't heard that phrase before, is just to spend 20 minutes thinking about what that might mean for them. What's the difference for them between working in their business and working on their business? Because I bet that for most people that do the kinds of things, that work with the kinds of people that we work with, that might be a phrase they haven't heard before. So that idea, right? And, I'm sure you can pick up on this from me, take it further. But that's simply the idea that most people that do the kinds of things that people do that listen to this probably enjoy working in their business. They enjoy the performing. They even enjoy talking to clients, but they enjoy the stuff that is inside the business, going out and doing the technical work of the performances and stuff.
Learning songs.
Yeah, you're right. That's all in the business. And that idea of working on the business is where you actually take a step back, isn't it? And you put your CEO hat on and you say, okay, well, you look at the business from a different perspective, don't you? You say, okay, well, and again, that involves knowing your goals and your priorities, and what do I maybe need more of coming into the business? What do I maybe need to be doing a bit less of? But you're right, you can't do that if you don't. It's not you can't. It's very hard to do that if you don't set aside specific time to be in that, because it's a very different headspace, isn't it?
Yeah, and I find I can't switch between things very easily. I need when I need to get in the zone for something. So, for example, if I'm just doing editing, I need to be doing that day. I'm not switching between doing something else. But then if I set the day where I'm going to be working on my website, for example, then I can get focus on that, and you get into, what's the word for it?
Like flow
state for things. And I'm sure that works as well for when you're rehearsing songs or working on something like that. But yeah, I think maybe we'll go more into that on another episode, and maybe some of the things that you can be working on for your business, as we mentioned a few, and maybe in an episode that's about to come out, with email lists and lead funnels and all these really nerdy, that I love, business terms that I'm sure a lot of musicians don't really care about but kind of need to. So yeah, that's kind of where I want this podcast a little bit to go towards, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a bit off topic.
No, I think that's great. And yeah, I look forward to listening to those episodes too. And when you mentioned about whether or not they care about those things, that's just a matter of being able to see how it could help, isn't it? I'm sure that when I first got out of music college, I didn't really care about email newsletter lists and mailing lists and that kind of thing. But when I realized that perhaps I want to be able to communicate with people that might want to buy stuff, suddenly it seems like a really good idea, doesn't it? And
yeah,
so yeah, it's absolutely. And I think that people are going to find a lot of really useful information in those upcoming episodes too.
Let's hope so. So I think we've kind of covered imposter syndrome and overwhelm, apart from the spinning imposter syndrome on its head and turning it into a positive. And this stems from a podcast that I listened to recently. It's actually quite an old episode now, I think, but on Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO podcast, he had Jimmy Carr on, and they were talking about imposter syndrome. And Jimmy Carr actually had a really insightful way of describing it, and saying that you should feel imposter syndrome at certain periods of your life if you are setting goals for yourself and pushing towards them. You should feel uncomfortable, and you should feel like you're an imposter there, because you're new there and you're learning and you're pushing yourself. And I just thought it was a really great way of spinning it on its head, and turning it into a positive.
Yeah, I mean that's a beautiful. We'd call it a reframe, wouldn't we? which is where you take a thing and you just look at it from a slightly different angle, and it changes the meaning of it. So the fact that someone might be experiencing something like imposter syndrome no longer means that they're deficient in some way. What it means is they're pushing forwards and they're doing new things, which of course is really positive. And yes, that's the thing. You've got to treat stuff like, I would say, little sentences like that, little nuggets of wisdom like that. They're hats, right? And what you've got to do is you've got to go into your day and you've got to go, right, I'm going to put the Jimmy Carr hat on, right? And I'm going to go through my day and I'm going to treat it like that. I'm going to treat it with that reframe and say, if I feel that, it's because I'm doing X, Y, and Z. And see if that helps you move forward and do more things or take different decisions. If it does, write it down and keep reminding, keep saying it in your head, because that will become part of how you think about it. And again, sometimes when you try on a hat like that, a bit like with some of those time management things, it actually doesn't quite fit you, So for you and I, that sentence from Jimmy Carr, we go, that's great.
Yeah.
Because that hat fits us really nicely, and it will be useful for us to remind ourselves of that. And it's in the same way that it's Jimmy Carr, one of the things that is implicit within what Jimmy Carr says there is that it's okay to have those feelings, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we're going to say that it means this, it means you're pushing forwards. And in the same way that it's okay to have that experience, it's also okay for that sentence not to magically transform your experience of life, It might be that you need just need a different shaped hat. And it's a completely worthwhile activity to go and try on a load of hats. We call that, that would be just like your personal philosophy, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Personal philosophy. And that is important. I think it's a useful thing to spend a little bit of time with each week, I would say. I don't know, have you heard of that guy, Jim Rohn? Have we talked about him before?
No, I don't think so.
So Jim Rohn was an American business speaker, and he he would get called in by big companies to kind of like not only motivate, but, really deeply sort of inspire their sort of workforces and stuff. And and he would say something like that, like understanding your own personal philosophy. What do you have to say in a given situation to make you take action and to help you feel all right and all that stuff? And if that phrase about you should feel imposter syndrome because, it means you're pushing forwards, if that's useful for you, put it in your little book of, personal philosophy, so that next time you have a problem, you can go through the book and you can go, that's what I needed to hear today.
Yeah.
But that's a great one. Yeah. Thank you, Jimmy Carr.
Yeah. Surprisingly, I think. But man, I think that pretty much covers everything, unless there's anything that you think that we should talk about that we haven't talked about. Could
I leave a book recommendation?
Absolutely.
So if people are having any of those experiences like imposter syndrome or overwhelm, which of course most of us do at some stage, there's a book by Dr. Richard Bandler, and the title's a bit cheesy, but it's really helpful. It's called Get the Life You Want. And what that book is, I know it's a cheesy sounding American title, but don't let that put you off. What that book is a list of, if you like, recipes for dealing with things like imposter syndrome, overwhelm. And what it does is it takes you through some of those NLP methods. It's not exactly like working with someone one-on-one, but I don't think the book's very expensive. You can get it from Amazon or from, Waterstones or wherever. And it's just some really easy to follow little procedures that you can just do straight away and play with. And that, it wasn't that exact book, but it was like an earlier, very similar thing that first got me into all these things, and just discovering the power of being able to do something about it yourself, like immediately, not slowly over 10 sessions. Like the fact that you could make a little tweak about how you thought about something in your head, a bit like that Jimmy Carr reframe. That's one simple thing, a simple idea, that could make a big difference. And what that book is full of is ways to realize what your simple ideas that could make a big difference are.
Awesome, man.
So yeah, Get the Life You Want by Dr. Richard Bandler.
Yeah, I love books like that. There's another, and slightly off topic, but another one with a cheesy American title like that was How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is not as cheesy as it sounds. It's actually a really cool book. Have you read it?
Dale
Yeah. Written in like 1903 or something like that. But still, and it's just kind of making business not sleazy and slimy. You don't have to be like a horrible salesperson. It's just like, yeah, it's not as cringy as the title sounds. But yeah, another cool book if anyone wants to go and have to check that out as well. Awesome, man. Love that one. So I think if you're up for coming up on another one as well, we can just call you a co-host at this point and go from there.
Can I have a cap? I feel like we need a full-time function musician podcast.
Absolutely,
cap or something.
Yeah. We'll get them printed. Awesome, man.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks again. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. It's always a pleasure talking to John, and I'm sure we'll definitely do some more stuff like this. On that note, if there is anything that you would like covered on the podcast, any other subjects like this that we can dive into, or something that you'd like to discuss, then please get in touch, and you can do that by emailing me at feedback@thefulltimefunctionmusicianpodcast.co.uk, or you can find me on Instagram at InFocusRecordingCo. Links will be in the episode description. That's it for this one. I'll catch you next week for episode 23.